Welcome everybody to the second lecture in our summer lecture series titled From the Rooftops. These lectures are coming to you from the Landscape Architecture Department here in the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Richard Weller and I'm the chair of the department, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome Sonja Dümpelmann to the digital lectern. Sonja's research and writing focuses on 19th and 20th century landscape history and contemporary landscape architecture, predominantly in the Western world. Her work explores the transatlantic transfer of ideas, the role of politics in design, the role of technology in design, and the influence of science over design. And importantly, Sonja's work focuses on the histories of women working in the field of landscape architecture. Sonja is the author of many books, the most recent being Seeing Trees, A History of Street Trees in New York City and Berlin. This was published by Yale University Press in 2019. And as has been the case with other books by Sonja, Seeing Trees won the John Brinkerhoff Jackson Book Prize. Before joining the Department of Landscape Architecture here at Penn, Sonja held associate and assistant professorships at Harvard University, the University of Maryland, and Auburn University. She has a doctorate in landscape history from the University of the Arts in Berlin and an MLA from Leibniz Universität in Hanover. She has curated exhibitions on landscape-related topics in Germany and the US, and she has worked as a landscape architect in Studio Paolo Borghi in Switzerland. So with that, I welcome Sonja, as I said, to the digital lectern, and I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. This is one of the installments of From the Rooftop. My name is Sonja Dümpelmann and I'm a historian of urban landscapes and environments and an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture. I will be talking about trees in urban areas, so in cities. Trees in general have played an important role for us humans as long as we can remember. We have a special relationship with trees, which is also often given expression in their anthropomorphization. In playful ways, this anthropomorphization blurs distinctions between nature and culture. Some Greek myths, for example, include dryads that are half tree, half woman, or women that morph into trees, as seen in the 16th century illustration. A more recent example are these winter trees, and the trees in these cartoons, and I'll leave you for a minute to actually look at these. Trees are thirsty, and this is a 1945 photograph of a young horse chestnut tree in the city of Berlin. In the background you see some derelict houses, so bombed out houses just after the Second World War, and as you can see, somebody has fastened a note to this horse chestnut tree, and what it says there is, "I am thirsty," in Berlin slang. So trees are thirsty. More tragically, they also commit suicide, they need surgery and chemotherapy, and their diseases have been diagnosed with the help of endoscopy and computer tomography. And of course, there is perhaps no other location where people and trees come together more closely than in our cities, except of course if we happen to live in a forest. Street trees are therefore often the subject of distress and pleasure, of complaints and praise, and of hatred and passion. They elicit strong emotions either way. Some of the biggest urban conflicts have revolved around them. They have stood at the very core of events that have shaped and characterized the evolution of the modern city. In the second half of the 19th century, when trees were first planted systematically along streets throughout entire cities, urbanists and designers, tree experts and arborists, city officials and citizens had to resolve the growing tension between the modernization of the city and the conservation of trees. They had to deal with the tensions between nativism and globalism, the vernacular and modernity, nature's agency and human actors, and between technology, science, economy, and aesthetics. The history of street tree planting therefore offers insights into how our relationship with nature and the city has changed over time. Street trees have been considered variously as aesthetic makeup, creators of space, territorial markers, instruments of defense, emancipation and empowerment, sanitizers, air conditioners, nuisances, upholders of moral values, economic engines, scientific instruments, and ecological habitat. In the following, I will give you an overview over some of the main ideas and topics that I have dealt with in my recent book, Seeing Trees. These reveal and exemplify how political both the nature and culture, or perhaps we could more fittingly say the nature culture of trees in our cities are. Seeing Trees is a book about trees in New York City and Berlin, but many of the frameworks and findings I offer can also be mapped onto other cities, even though the specificity of time and place is of course key in every street tree story. So in general, I could say that I tell parts of New York City's and Berlin's late 19th century and 20th century landscape histories through these cities' street trees. But why these two cities? When the systematic planting of trees along streets began in the late 19th century, these two cities were the most notable cultural centers in the US and the German Reich. Berlin quickly took on the role of model street tree city in the German states. But in New York City as well, citizens and the early promoters of street tree planting looked to Berlin, besides Paris, as a model. And being the city and cultural hub it is, over the course of the 20th century, American cities also looked towards New York City and its expertise regarding trees. If this dense city with its challenging light conditions could do it, other cities and less urban and dense cities in the US should be able to plant trees too, the argument went. The book is further premised on the fact that German scientific forestry, as it developed in the German states from the 18th century onwards, informed the development of scientific forestry in the US in the late 19th century. Many German-born foresters like Bernhard Eduard Ferno, whom you see here, emigrated to the United States, and many early American foresters like William Fox trained at German forestry schools. Myra Lloyd Duck, one of the first American women to serve on a state forest commission, in this case the Pennsylvania Forest Commission, traveled to Germany to study and observe forestry there firsthand. In the US, an interest in what was called urban forestry or city forestry developed in the 1880s and 1890s. And the developments and knowledge in this area were finally transferred back to Germany, especially beginning in the years after the Second World War. Tree seeds and cultivars, as well as the practices of street tree planting and care, and technologies and machines were exchanged between people, cities, and countries. This material and immaterial exchange regarding street trees pervades the book in general. To give you an example, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both New York City and Washington, D.C. aspired to create a tree-lined showcase street modeled on Berlin's Unter den Linden. So here you see Unter den Linden, and plantings along Massachusetts Avenue in D.C. and Broadway north of Columbus Circle in New York City were not merely intended to copy Unter den Linden, but to outdo Berlin's historic tree-lined boulevard. In turn, almost a century later, in the 1990s, the most common linden cultivar on Berlin's famous boulevard was little-leaf linden greenspire. William Flemer III had bred greenspire at his Princeton nursery in the United States. The tree was patented in 1961, and it reached a global market, including Berlin's Unter den Linden, in the decades that followed. The book is divided into two parts. The first part tells stories revolving around street trees in New York City. This part is followed by chapters that deal with the history of street trees in Berlin. Seeing trees is not strictly speaking a comparative history, but it does draw comparisons and it reveals relationships between the stories in New York City and Berlin. It also puts into historical context current developments regarding street tree planning and planting and urban forestry more generally. In fact, as much as street trees were planted for their aesthetic effects, they were also always planted for their climatological functions. The idea to combat climate change and improve urban microclimates through street tree planting campaigns, as they have been carried out in the last decades in New York City with the Million Trees campaign, but also in many other cities, is not a new idea. Neither is the method of CO2 compensation to slow down climate change and reduce the warming of the atmosphere. In 1958, Chauncey D. Leakey, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, warned of, and I'm quoting him, the tremendous increase in the blanket of carbon dioxide that would inevitably tend to increase heat capture from the sun. And he did this in a widely received paper at the National Conference on Air Pollution in Washington, D.C. He asked what we would do once the huge polar ice caps melted, leading to sea level rise, and he suggested planting 10 trees for every automobile and 100 for every truck. In both Berlin and New York City, the first initiatives for a systematic street tree planting in the late 19th century go back to concerns about the respective cities' climate and related public hygiene. Street trees were considered both shade trees that provided cooling effects in the summer heat and ornamental trees that were pleasing to look at and thought to reduce modern nervousness in the process. New York City's poor sanitary and hygienic conditions were exacerbated in the late 19th century due to population growth and increasing industrialization. It was then that New York's eminent physician, Stephen Smith, who pioneered the city's sanitary reforms and founded the Metropolitan Board of Health, argued that trees could save lives. Smith was the author of a groundbreaking study that correlated children's mortality from diarrheal diseases with high temperatures. Based upon his statistics, in the 1870s, the physician concluded that climate mitigation in the city could save 5,000 to 8,000 lives per year. For this purpose, Smith recommended planting street trees. To illustrate the enormous effectiveness attributed to trees' climatological and cooling functions, Smith drew attention to what became known as the Washington Elm Study. Attributed to Harvard College mathematics professor Benjamin Peirce, the study claimed that the famous Washington elm standing on the Cambridge Common, Massachusetts, had an estimated crop of 7 million leaves that would amount to an area of 5 acres that was active in gas exchange. These numbers help to substantiate and rationalize the shade and cooling effect of trees that individuals commonly only perceived subjectively. Smith not only drafted and introduced into the legislature a bill for the establishment of a Bureau of Forestry and the cultivation of street trees, but given that the bill stalled and was only passed in 1902 and then still did not provide the necessary structure and budget for municipal street tree planting, Smith also became active in the Private Tree Planting Association. This association assisted residents in tree planting and established a tenement shade tree committee in 1902 that planted trees along tenement blocks and in front of public schools, as you can see here on the occasion of Arbor Day. The association's first list of members read like a New York who's who. Besides Smith, it included philanthropist and housing reformer Robert DeForest, art dealer Samuel Avery, sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, industrialist and former mayor Edward Cooper, and the financiers J.P. Morgan, William Bayard Cutting, William Collins Whitney, and others. The sponsorship of today's tree planting campaigns by multinational corporations like Toyota, who was the lead sponsor for Million Trees, therefore has a precedent. Morgan's, Cuttings, and Whitney's 19th century financial empires already spanned the world, and the men may even have been aware of urban trees' entanglement in far-reaching ecological networks. But at the time they were, of course, mostly concerned about the local climate and the aesthetics of their business headquarters. One of the key observations underlying the stories in this book is the fact that in the process of cultivating trees and planting them along streets, cities were naturalized and trees were urbanized. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tree planting became an integral part of the urbanization process, transcending the artificial distinctions between rural and urban, natural and cultural. In their search for what German experts called a Musterbaum and what early American city foresters called the ideal or model tree, nurserymen tried to cultivate a new ideal street tree that would meet the social and economic requirements in the city. A tree that could resist air and soil pollution, did not attract insects, that had a small and narrow crown adapted to restricted space and lacking light, and that lost its leaves late in the year and in a short time period. Species with character traits beyond easy human control were considered unsuitable. For example, the cottonwood was thought inappropriate because it shed its seed in a downy, cottony tuft that clung to the clothing of passers-by, causing annoyance. This so-called summer snow, created by poplar seeds, in this case in the middle of summer in Helsinki, was considered undesirable in early 20th century New York City. Trees planted in rows and in a regular order were to render the city beautiful, civilized, refined, and attractive. But within the uniformity that trees could provide, it was also considered important to have variety. In the US, Washington, D.C. had set an early example for a comprehensive, unifying yet variable street tree system in the 1870s, planting different tree species in different streets. More ephemeral effects like fall color also played a role in providing variety, as did the shadow that was cast by trees. To achieve the serial street tree aesthetic, systematic tree planting and care was necessary. For this purpose, tree experts sought to institute a managerial and administrative system. In New York City, in 1914, Stephen Smith organized for the first street tree survey to be undertaken in Manhattan. Landscape engineering professors Henry Francis and Laurie Cox from the New York State College of Forestry at Syracuse University surveyed street trees using a system of index cards and maps and drew up a first street tree system for the island of Manhattan. They also made recommendations for new administrative units that were to manage street tree planting and care in the city. Furthermore, they developed proposals to standardize protective elements like tree guards and grates, and here you see specifications for different tree grate types that came with the names like New York, New Haven, Knickerbocker, and Manhattan. But to maintain the ideal street tree and its aesthetic appeal as part of a series also meant maintaining symmetrical crowns. Asymmetry signified improper care and disease. To produce vital street trees of the same symmetrical form and dimension in big numbers, tree experts suggested the employment of a new optical instrument. This was the dendroscope. Imported to the US from France, where it had been invented in the 1860s for use on country estates, this handy contrivance was to guarantee the most beautiful canopy shape. Holding the dendroscope, a cardboard with a hole in the shape of a tree in it at the level of the eye, while moving around the tree, its operator could give instructions to the pruner to achieve this desired tree shape. By cutting the tree into the shape that was projected onto it through the dendroscope, three-dimensional nature was made to copy the ideal shape on the two-dimensional picture plane. Through the use of the dendroscope, street trees could be forced into shape. The dendroscope could help to economize arboriculture and standardize tree shape and urban beautification. As shown by the dendroscope, practices commonly applied to trees outside of cities were transferred to the city. If tree guards had been used to protect trees on pastures against the appetites of livestock, and you see this on the left, in the city they saved street trees from hungry horses and urinating dogs. Before the rise of motor traffic, most mechanical injuries to trees were caused by horses munching away at street trees used as hitching posts. And here you see some photographs, but also some drawings and cartoons to this effect. And this could in fact reach extremes, as you can see in this photograph taken in the 1890s along a street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where literally every single tree had been snacked upon by a horse. So whereas the cavities of notable old trees had for centuries been boarded up or filled with various natural materials, by the early 20th century, modern, or purportedly modern, concrete fillings had become a standard practice, ostensibly prolonging street trees' lives. Tree and bird conservation efforts also began outside of urban areas, leading to enthusiastic responses in cities by the turn of the 20th century. Street trees were planted to provide bird habitats, and bird sanctuaries, baths, feeding stations, and nesting boxes were established throughout public urban parks. It had become clear that birds were needed to keep insects at bay, who otherwise would harm trees. Although street trees were planted first and foremost for aesthetic and climatological purposes, that means their more intangible and immaterial qualities, at various moments throughout the 20th century, particularly in times of crisis, they also became a life-saving material resource, turning the city into a forest or orchard that could be harvested. Street trees therefore turned the city into a territory in which natural resources were produced and not only consumed. For example, in March 1945, that means only 7 weeks before German capitulation, the German Reichs Committee for the Utilization of Unfermented Fruit requested that Berlin's district departments of gardens enlist all mountain ash standing along the city's streets as vitamin providers for Berlin's population. Since 1934, research into vitamins, their sources, and industrial production had been part of Nazi biopolitics that sought to create a healthy, resilient, and strong people ready to fight and win the war. Due to the high vitamin C and ascorbic acid content in mountain ash berries, the species' upright growth, and its high and loose yet beautifully shaped canopy, the committee considered the mountain ash an ideal roadside tree that could provide the country and its military with life-saving vitamins. With the advancement of the Allied forces on German territory by the beginning of 1945, it had become clear that Berlin itself would need to provide the resources necessary for its citizens' survival. In response to the request by the committee, the Charlottenburg District Department, so one of the district departments in the city of Berlin, reported around 680 trees of the sorbus family standing along the district's streets, including mountain ash. It estimated that each tree could provide 1.5 kilograms of fruit. Skeptical of the endeavor, however, and weary of the additional work involved, it stressed the berry's bitterness and its inability to provide the necessary labor to collect them. The Allies defeated Germany and Berlin only some weeks later, but of course the necessity to provide for food and life-saving vitamins was as current as ever. A year later, mountain ash was among the species subject to a new decree for the protection of all wild woody fruit species in Berlin. The decree sought to secure life-saving resources and solve a vital conflict. Many fruit-bearing trees and shrubs were being used as firewood. Another story shows just how contentious the use of street trees as firewood became in post-war Berlin. During the Berlin blockade in October 1948, the Western Allies ordered the felling of every second street tree in their occupation zones to secure necessary firewood for the winter. Many Berlin citizens regarded the Allied order with disdain. They wanted to see reconstruction and replanting, not further destruction. But the Soviet military government had closed the transportation corridors to the western sectors, and their energy supply was a huge challenge. In contrast, Berlin's Soviet sector received coal supplies from the Soviet occupation zone in Poland. Although the Berlin magistrate, which was the urban government at the time, Although this government was able to negotiate a reduction of the initial amount of lumber production requested from street trees, the press in the Soviet sector was quick to instrumentalize the issue for propaganda purposes, quite literally using the discussion about street tree felling to further incite the first ideological battles of the Cold War. What the West considered a fight for liberty was, as the communist press argued at the time, a disgraceful tree crime and a barbaric act. As one of the daily newspapers first published by the Red Army summed up in one of its October articles chronicling West Berlin's deforestation, everybody who muttered about a Berlin blockade and considered the airlift necessary was guilty of deforesting the city. Street trees were used to achieve autarky, and I show how they were used as weapons of defense more or less indirectly. Here you see workmen treating trees lining one of the streets in Berlin's northwesternmost corner. During the last months of the war, these trees had been equipped with explosives so that they could be used as anti-tank traps of last resort. The explosives were fixed to the stems by German military pioneers after the stems had been indented on the street side. Setting off the explosives would have caused the trees to fall across the road, and in this way could have slowed down the Allies' access to and from a nearby airport. This late and desperate act of defense by the Germans was only rediscovered in the summer of 1955, when one of the trees equipped with explosives was hit badly by a storm and had to be cut down. Many other trees along the roadside had been outfitted with munition that by this time had been partly overgrown. As a result, the explosives had gone unnoticed and forgotten, and the trees had survived. In 1955, when this photo was taken, efforts were made to remove any remaining explosives in the trees along the street to increase the trees' chances of a long life. Street trees literally and figuratively demarcated and delimited more or less porous boundaries, and they were used as instruments of identity politics in a positive and negative sense. Political conflict and nativist ideologies were projected onto urban trees, and they became carriers and signifiers of xenophobic sentiment. Street trees were planted with the intention of evoking feelings of neighborhood and citywide pride and belonging. For example, New York City's 1943 planting lists for post-war street tree planting showed the predominance of different species in the various boroughs. Oriental plane in Manhattan, Norway maple and Oriental plane in Brooklyn, pin oak, linden, and American elm in the Bronx, pin oak in Queens, and a mixture of Norway maple, pin oak, and red oak in Richmond, which is Staten Island. Berlin's citywide tree planting concept after the fall of the wall ensured the city's renown as the city of lindens. Berlin's linden trees planted along its most famous boulevard Unter den Linden that you see here in 1967 and its many radial streets had a centripetal and unifying effect at various moments in the city's history. Yet at times, certain species also evoked xenophobic reactions, demanding their eradication and replacement. In New York City, opinions about the ailanthus, the tree of heaven that is no longer planted, varied over time and moved between assessments of most and least ideal street tree. Originally imported to the United States in the late 18th century, in New York City it caused a discussion, inspired an affectionate poem, and, as you will know, the title of a famous book, Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. In 1841, famed landscape gardener Andrew Jackson Downing gave the ailanthus his blessing as an ideal street tree. Among the reasons for this metropolitan favorite were its survival in meager and barren soil, its short leaf fall period coinciding with the first frost, and most importantly, Downing's praise for the tree being perfectly free from insects. But the enthusiasm did not last long, not even with Downing himself. In the 1850s, a debate erupted about the suitability of the species that had in the 1930s and 40s been planted in great numbers along Manhattan streets. In the political climate of the 1850s that was increasingly characterized by the nativist and anti-immigrant sentiment of the Know-Nothing movement, opinions began to change. The discussion that included fierce outcries against the tree as well as appeasing but definite arguments for it was incited first by the odor of the male tree's flowers, and some years later by the notice that its bark contained poisonous oils. Troubled by the oppressive, nauseating, and poisonous male flower odor, as some citizens said, many citizens began to consider the ailanthus a nuisance and public health hazard. The xenophobic criticism soon incriminated the imported species as filthy and worthless foreigner and fragrant stranger that should be replaced with hardy, sweet, and indigenous species. Downing himself contributed to this debate that unfolded after his death by opening an editorial in his journal, The Horticulturalist, with the warrior cry, "Down with the ailanthus." Caught by the nativist wave, Downing now saw in the anthus a usurper in rather bad odor at home, and I'm quoting him here. A tree which has come over to this land of liberty under the garb of utility to make foul the air with its pestilent breath and devour the soil with its intermeddling roots, a tree that has the fair outside and the treacherous heart of the Asiatics, and that has played us so many tricks that we find that we have caught a Tartar which it requires something more than a Chinese wall to confine within limits. So as you can see, this is incredibly discriminatory. In contrast, those in favor thought that the ailanthus absorbed as much odor from the city's streets as it emitted aroma. They considered the tree one of the city's principal ornaments, cherished its various qualities. In 1902, the Park Department's landscape architect Samuel Parsons reported that whereas 56 streets planted along one street in Manhattan had died due to too shallow soil above the rock surface, a nearby feral ailanthus had split the rock and was growing profusely. By the time the Park Department had finally taken charge of street trees in the 1910s, fewer ailanthus trees were being planted, but the tree was still on the planting list, and in 1913, the Park Department planted 32 ailanthus on Mandan Street, the second largest number of one species planted in Manhattan after the Oriental Plain. Street tree advocates, on the one hand, appreciated the tree of heaven for its lush green foliage, tropical effect, as they said, and luxuriant oriental appearance, as well as its hardiness and resilience. But they also warned of its brittle wood, and they warned of the tree's straggly, uneven growth, which caused a rather unsightly appearance in the winter. By the 1960s, the ailanthus had been abandoned from the desirable species list, and its planting as street tree was no longer permitted. The species was simply too costly to maintain and manage as ideal and standardized street tree, the argument went, undesirable along streets. It was now also objected to in other types of plantings where it had become a weed because it displaced more desirable tree and shrub species. Depending on the context of the times, the conception of the ideal street tree depended as much on species characteristics and the respective urban environment as it did on politics. The topic of trees attracted attention from both progressives and conservatives, but particularly from the latter. On both sides of the Atlantic, many early nationalist conservative landscape designers embraced trees, in some cases publishing entire books on trees and their use in urban and rural environments, and one of them you see here. In the years after World War II, when landscape designers sought to use street tree and large-scale tree planting to protect Berlin from desertification, they uncritically continued the association of cities with deserts, an association common in anti-urban conservative and nationalist circles in the previous decades. Eugenics and race theories had bolstered this connection already in the early 20th century. Many conservatives believed that urbanization threatened the superior Germanic race that was considered to have evolved in the wooded areas of the temperate zone, now deforested and threatened by desertification. Tree planting was therefore perceived as salvation. Not only were trees thought to cleanse the air and provide shade and lumber, the argument was that by providing a healthy living environment for the Germanic race, trees could also prevent the southern race from taking over. And this was a code for the Jewish population in part. But as much as street trees were used to protect and segregate and to give expression to anti-Semitic sentiment, as you can see, they were also used to overcome physical and mental boundaries. Various citizen groups planted street trees to reclaim their right to the city. In New York City, women and African Americans respectively used street tree planting to reclaim their right to the city. In the early decades of the 20th century, female New York philanthropists, social reformers, activists, and early design professionals played an important role in urban tree planting and preservation. They embraced street trees as a means and symbol of empowerment, emancipation, and even resistance. Initiating street tree planting campaigns, the women transgressed the separation of private and public spheres and the binary of male-coded architecture and female-coded nature. Whereas the city and its marketplace were largely determined and controlled by men, around the turn of the century, trees, which were considered an element of refinement and civility, both began to symbolize the female transgression of the domestic and public spheres and to be a means and material for this transgression. If in the 19th century the luscious tree-lined streets of the residential neighborhoods outside of Manhattan's business district had still acted as an indicator of the refined domestic female sphere, by the turn of the century, initiatives to plant trees in the business district and near the city center were a way for women to quite literally break out of the domestic sphere and claim and mark their place and space in the public realm. Street trees therefore both marked and created elite and female space in the city. While at the turn of the century female activists, reformists, and philanthropic ventures were elitist endeavors that have continued, in times of crises, working and middle-class women discovered tree planting as a way to shape and claim their right to the city as well. World War I, for instance, propelled women with and without horticultural training in German cities to tend to street trees and take over from men. In the United States, African American grassroots activism, often led by women, also began a street tree planting movement. In 1964, African American residents of the Brooklyn-Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood began to improve neighborhood blocks through tree planting. Many streets in Bedford-Stuyvesant had turned from this to this in only half a century. African American citizens transformed trees into a means of empowerment and emancipation within the civil rights movement. Through planting and maintaining street trees, they asserted their rights to the city and to its spaces in general. Tree planting and conservation activities provided the most vulnerable and powerless groups, women and children, with a way to make themselves heard and seen. Plantings became their tool of community building, as well as a civil right that could be used against ghettoization. One of the things distinguishing the tree planting activities from other civil rights initiatives was not only their grassroots do-it-yourself and self-help character, but their aesthetic. Trees made a difference in a visual and spatial sense, as well as in a more ephemeral atmospheric sense. Trees could fill the visual and phenomenological gap between top-down policies and the actual experience in the neighborhood. In 1967, as a result of the grassroots, or in this case tree roots initiatives that drew the attention of Mayor John Lindsay, the Park Department instituted the Tree Matching Program. This meant that for every 4 trees that a block association planted, it would receive 6 additional ones from the city. But trees were and still are not always considered beneficial amenities in urban streets. As you will be aware, probably, many disenfranchised citizens today oppose tree planting plantings because they fear losing their homes as a result of gentrification. And especially beginning in the 1950s and 60s, some citizens viewed street trees as obstacles against clear oversight on inner city streets. They feared that trees would provide hideouts for criminals. I also explore the relationship between top-down and bottom-up initiatives for the protection and management of street trees in East and West Berlin in the 1970s and 80s. At the time, street trees were dying because of increasing traffic, air pollution, and the use of de-icing salts. For East and West Berliners alike, street tree planting, care, and protection was a means to oppose the respective state and its environmental politics. The new genre of street tree art and various citizen initiatives for street tree protection in East and West Berlin forced the city governments to more effectively care for their street trees. The two posters you see here are an example of this new environmentalist art genre. The posters are by the East Berlin graphic artist Manfred Butzmann. In 1978, he designed the poster entitled "A Place for Trees" on the left. A space in the title's typography and a series of photographs of unoccupied curbside tree pits of different shapes and sizes and in different conditions called attention to the voids left behind by vandalized, damaged, and felled trees, and by trees that had never been planted. Following up on this work 7 years later, in 1985, Weitzman produced a second poster entitled "No Place for Trees," the poster that you see on the right. This poster featured a series of photographs taken in August 1985 of defoliated, poorly growing, and unhealthy street trees along one of the central streets in East Berlin. Taken together, the posters illustrated the paradoxical situation of East Berlin's street tree condition. On the one hand, there was space. On the other hand, there was none. By highlighting the lack and decay of East Berlin street trees, Butzmann also drew attention to the degradation of public space and environment more generally. Like much of his work, Butzmann's street tree posters indicted the state's neglect of environmental concerns in public open space, the provision of which was part of the state's self-proclaimed larger socialist values. In an ironic twist, therefore, his street tree work subversively sought to encourage citizens to take ownership of the neglected socialist public space by planting trees in it. And in many instances, they actually did. The East German state first tolerated activist street tree planting campaigns because they were relatively easy for urban governments to control or take over. Trees quite literally provided the space that the government was willing to cede to environmental activists. Even though the activist street tree planting campaigns were reactions to the environmental degradation that the government allowed, they appeared neutral enough to give the activists an outlet without seriously compromising the state's power and its laissez-faire environmental politics. The state only terminated cooperation and began to criminalize tree planting activists once it realized that the nascent environmentalism could not be tamed and that related political interests could not be neutralized. Nevertheless, street trees and grassroots tree planting initiatives in East Germany gathered together like-minded people in oppositional environmental groups, which contributed to fostering a second public sphere, the first public sphere being the public discursive space controlled by the socialist state. The generation of this second public sphere played an important role in the opposition against the GDR's dictatorship, which ultimately contributed to its fall in November 1989. So among many other things, this shows how seemingly simple, ephemeral, and local activities related to urban nature can, in extension, have an impact on events that shape global history, in this case, the end of the Cold War. Prompted by citizen activism in the 1970s and 80s, experts in East and West Germany devised methods for the value and risk assessment of trees. And in West Berlin, they used aerial infrared photography to facilitate the assessment of tree damage and its spatial and temporal relationship and development throughout the city. Seeing the larger picture from above helped to identify, address, and ultimately remedy some of the problems on the ground that had been pointed out by various citizen initiatives. East and West Berlin were competing in the re-establishment and restoration of their green heritage. Already during the Reconstruction period after the Second World War, interest in the various climatological, aesthetic, and psychological functions of street trees had peaked in both parts of the city. Research projects were undertaken to scientifically prove previous pseudoscientific assumptions regarding the health and aesthetic functions of street trees. In East Berlin, the dust-binding capacity of urban trees and their climatological impact were part of a larger research project in the post-war years. Dust was a huge concern in the bombed-out, rubble-strewn inner cities. In post-war West Berlin, where automobile traffic increased much faster than in East Germany, trees' capacity to buffer sound was an important research topic. And here you see an illustration from a research project undertaken at the Technical University in Berlin in the 1960s to determine the capacity of buffering sound of the various tree species in the city. In East Berlin and East Germany more generally, landscape architects sought to base their practice in Marxist theory and socialist ideology. Although streets continued to be lined with trees, landscape architect Harry Günther feared the monotony of regular lines of street trees. In socialist East Germany, he easily found an ideological argument to dismiss regular street tree rows if they did not share the urbanistic importance of boulevards like Unter den Linden. After all, regular street tree rows were a conceptual, as he said, relic of the feudal epoch that had actually been overcome. So on the emotional level as well, the beauty of plants was thought to help citizens overcome a city's capitalist asphalt atmosphere, as people were saying. Incited by the Cold War, the notion was that communists would use street trees, parks, and gardens to create happy cities symbolic of life, whereas capitalists would drown their cities in asphalt. Street trees contributed to the city's image, and East Berlin's government considered a well-maintained streetscape a mirror of the Soviet sector's economic progress. East German landscape architects and officials emphasized street trees' materialist functions and their efficient production, planting, and maintenance in what they called socialist city greening. Searching for ever more efficient planting techniques and ways to industrialize tree production, landscape architects undertook studies for the vegetative propagation of large caliber trees in so-called tube containers. This method was patented in 1975, and it enabled the production of sturdy 3-meter-tall trees without multiple transplantations in only 6 months instead of the usual 12 years. The method was also thought to benefit the GDR's 1973 public housing program that was supposed to solve the housing problem by 1990 and led to the construction of new mass housing on greenfield sites on the city's periphery. Comprehensive street tree planting concepts were drawn up for these development areas and for entire new cities like the new industrial town of Eisenhüttenstadt. These tree planting concepts determined the characteristic plant palette for the various areas of a city or district on the basis of aesthetic, functional, ecological, and economic criteria. They also enabled the establishment of estimates of the number of trees of particular species that would need to be produced in the nurseries, thus supporting the centrally planned economy. The tree planting concept you see here was for a new residential district of mid-rise slab buildings which were inserted into an existing pine woods. The different hatcheries in the plan determined both the various planting designs and their functions. Leading tree species and undergrowth shrubs were determined, and the horizontal hatcher framing the development indicated the woods that were to be maintained and enriched by deciduous species. In West Berlin, as in other parts of West Germany, the opportunities offered by reconstruction inspired landscape architects to discuss the street tree aesthetic and consider alternate street tree planting paradigms. These recalled pre-war and even late 19th century aesthetic ideals that often built on nationalist conservative sentiment. Although rows of trees planted at regular intervals were the most practical and efficient street tree design, even the most ardent street tree promoters and proponents in the late 19th century had harbored some doubt about the risks of monotonous street tree rows. As a result, at the turn of the century, the planting paradigm of the single tree motif and of loosely planted irregular tree groups had gained some traction in the street tree literature of the time. It had also gained some traction among especially conservative urbanists who supported the picturesque aesthetic. In the 1930s, picturesque and irregular planting patterns along streets with front yards had not only been considered in keeping with the naturalist aesthetic that went hand in hand with the Nazis' blood and soil ideology, but it had also supported air raid protection measures. Berlin's garden director Josef Pertl had advised the departments of gardens to promote the use of single trees in the urban streetscape and the replacement of strict and straight tree rows in streets with front yards, in particular, with loose and irregular tree groups. So this replacement of tree rows by irregular tree groups had also been was also practical because lumber was desperately needed. In the US as well, street trees were during World War II considered a valuable protection against air raids. Entomologist Ephraim Porter Felt noted that looking down upon the treeless streets of a large city like New York sufficed to note the harsh outlines of the closely placed buildings and the accompanying dark shadows that could be broken up by street trees, in particular if they were planted in irregular groups. Like his colleagues in Germany, Felt promoted the planting of irregular groups of trees with foliage presenting a dissimilar texture or with variable branching habits for the purposes of air raid protection. During the war, therefore, regardless whether they were protecting against the sun, wind, or aerial attack, and whether they were growing along streets and parks or on private property, trees were thought to be contributors to national welfare and security. In post-war Berlin and West Germany more generally, the treatment of street trees continued along these lines and was further bolstered by the urban design paradigm of the dispersed city that was based upon a loose urban fabric consisting of housing slabs and also individual high-rise buildings that were embedded in ample green open space. West Berlin tree expert Rudolf Kuhn suggested that the new urban design paradigm required big, strong tree characters, as he said, and irregularly shaped groves and groups of trees. As integral components of this new city landscapes, trees were to be given the opportunity to follow their natural growth patterns. After East and West Berlin had been reunited in 1990, street trees were used to unify a heterogeneous urban fabric, level out an uneven tree canopy throughout the city, and re-establish Berlin's image as a green linden city. Tree planting was a displacement activity, an activity that sought to heal the fissures of the German psyche as well as the physical fissures of the urban fabric, an activity filled with the desire to make Berlin whole again and to overcome the different cultural traditions, frameworks, and collective memories in East and West Germany. Throughout their history, the linden trees of Berlin's iconic boulevard Unter den Linden have played a decisive role in the city's various unification efforts. In the last chapter of the book, I show, among other things, how the tree's inherent malleable nature turned the famous boulevard's rows of linden trees into one of the most permanent and long-lasting elements of Berlin's urban design. In fact, I would say also more generally that trees' inbuilt a priori obsolescence, death, has saved them from becoming truly obsolescent in our city and has enabled them to persist. Every tree death provides a literal and figurative space, an opening and a moment to decide whether and how the tree should be replaced. The opportunities this decision has offered societies and persons of subsequent generations has often led to the replanting of trees and therefore to their continuous presence in urban space, as in the prominent case of Unter den Linden, which you also see here directly after the Second World War. Indeed, it's organisms that adapt to urban conditions, that develop over time in often unpredictable ways, but that are also the result of techno-scientific production. And with a material afterlife as wood, wood pulp, and compost, street trees are perhaps one of the most long-standing modern elements in our urban environments. Because of trees' dynamic nature, life cycles, and limited lifespans, on the one hand, and their site specificity, localism, and relative permanence on the other, they both embrace and resist change. Street trees exhibit the ambiguities of modernity. They are appreciated for the durable physical spaces they create and for the temporary, ephemeral, and more intangible mental spaces and effects they produce.